Thank you very much. Put on the screen, this is Matthias's book, which has just been published in German about the French delegation. I'm very happy to be with my two friends, Michel and Matthias. I got to know Matthias when the Delphin de Bonaire was inaugurated at Lyon, at the Court of Justice there, and that's where we got to know the son and daughter of the minister, and these two are actually present today. And then they gave us a very interesting, a very moving personal archivist. And Dominique mentioned this earlier on, the fact that we've got these three magistrates here. Those are the three files and archives that were given by the three families here. And Falco, very interesting. I'm a magistrate. I'm at the Cour de Cassation, which is the Supreme Court, but I also work for the history of justice in France. And Pierre Truss had initially focused on that work and his role, in particular in the Barbie trial here. I'm very interested in, and that's the role Matthias talked about these what I call resistant magistrates who went to Nuremberg. What's interesting is to see how the magistrates, and that's the title of the book I published, which is a collection, Judge Vichy, and then afterwards which magistrates chaired the sessions at Nuremberg, and none of the members of the accusation were at Nuremberg just by chance here, members of the prosecution, so it's interesting to see the link here. In particular, Robert Falco and Delphine Leganis. Now, Robert Falco, he wasn't well known at all at the time, before the publication of his journal by his children. His Nuremberg journal. And the only image which we have of the judge Robert Falco, and we can see this in the documents by Taylor, so I need to speak a bit closer to the mic, it's true. In Taylor's document, he describes him as a kind of small magistrate, because he always enters the room first here, and he's going at a fast pace, and Henri Dondieu is next to him here, and he's the only one who's wearing his decorations here. None of the others was all debate about what they should dress, what they should wear here. It's described by everybody, because he was a judge, and judge they don't often talk except for the president of the hearing. Somebody discreet here, and they very often don't hear about them, and it's his journal, and able to get to know him better. And it's this man now I'd like to describe, thanks to his journal and what his family told, and personal investigation around Falco. Now, I'll talk about him briefly. He's a man of great general culture. He was a lawyer and then a magistrate. He was a secular Jew excluded by the Vichy regime. He was excluded in December 1940. He became a refugee in the free zone of area of powers, reintegrated after the liberation of France, and then in London, the London agreements that created the International Military Tribune for France, and he then became a magistrate alternate, and he's the one who will draft a report in terms of a rehabilitation of Baudelaire for the Fleur du Mal. He loved poetry here. He dealt with that. Begin Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire back here. Now, let me start off with a scene that took place the 13th of July 1946. Quite surprising. It's a weekend, and the judges listened to the defenders here in the exchange between the Judge Laurence and Judge Falco. They're walking next to the lake here, and they're talking about Frank's, what he had said, and they're talking about Streicher anti-Semitism here. And Robert Falco said, and this was the plea, and Falco, you can believe it, the measures that were done against me, it was by the French government. It's when I told them that I was tossed out of my court by the French state and I had to hide in the south of France. So 8 months after the trial opened, Judge Lawrence discovered that Falco was literally thrashed by the Vichy government, and Falco is the only particular person in that case by being persecuted by the Vichy regime. And the other lawyers, which we mentioned earlier on, Dubust, we heard about, the excellent communication and presentation by Serge Fuster as well, another lawyer. I had the pleasure to meet him. Serge Fuster is the pseudonym of Casamaya, for those who know. That was before the syndicate of magistrate, Herzog, Gartefer, and the only resistant was Delphine de Bonnet, who went via one of the camps, Buchenwald, and he was a war prisoner who we can see next to de Monton. And de Monton makes his presentation, his discourse. So this question about identity, and Falco spoke to Francis Bridgew, an American judge. I'm quoting Falco when he's writing this video, very proud to be the authentic descendant of a red-skinned prince, and he really has strong blue eyes, still blue eyes, and it's quite interesting to hear about that, considering the perception of the Americans. So throughout the trial, Falco will note down in a remarkable style all his impressions regarding the hearings with a subtle kind of appreciation. There were a lot of women actually drew the various scenes here, and he just jotted down impressions of the trial. And 65 years after the hearing, after trials, you can see what's going on in the mind of a judge. I know, because I'm a judge myself. We always have the impression of journalists, but what do the judges think at a given moment here? Let me take 3 or 4 examples. Even though it's writing 65 years later, we can at last discover the thoughts here. Common examples, extremely well. 28th of November, that's when was read the transcriptions of the telephone recording between Ribbentrop and Göring about the Anschluss and when they entered Vienna here. And we heard Göring, who's at home. He's having a coffee on his balcony. This is what I can hear on the radio, the acclamations when the Führer entered, the birds are chirping, and I'm happy, and the German delegation, they're just laughing. And Falco said the next day, but Göring isn't laughing as much when the next day, to talk about atrocities carried out by the Nazis, they showed the films that were shot in the camps here, when we can see the poor prisoners that are released. We can see people that can't even stand up here, pieces of cadavers that are moved by bulldozers. We can see the gas chambers and all that. The accused that are lit up in the room with a theatrical lamp, looking at these terrible pictures here. Kaijo seems to be impressed, whereas Sal seems not to want to watch it. He immediately found the right words here. Testimony. Robert Falco, like a lot, were impressed by that. Marie-Claude de Courtoyer, like everybody, in terms of her sheer sincerity here. And the words used by Falco were, she with a prophetic honesty and a contained honesty, describing the atrocities she saw here by a vibrating tone. Notes of a human emotion appears for the very first time in this room here and in this trial. Because otherwise it's highly documentary and technical, the overall ambience here. He also perfectly understands who's dominating the debates and the discussions. You can say Jackson, he's the main prosecutor, but he's very impressed by Göring. Quite a dominating room at the top, where he's throning as comfortable as if he were chairing the Reichstag. He's I wouldn't say he's admiring, but he's very impressed by Göring. The amazing dialectic skills of the man, at the same time quite charming, very authoritative, and obviously the people are listening to him. He's insisting on the duality between Jackson and Göring, and it's the latter that he's the advantage representative of the prosecutor. Jackson is impatient here, difficult to fight against this rock and this intelligence that has an answer to everything. The American prosecutor, who is totally miffed here, and he asks the president of the session to do something about, and Jackson is no longer on this pedestrian stone which he was on. He started with Göring, who is actually clearly the king in the room. And the last example, Falco is listening to the testimony of the head of the Auschwitz extermination camp, a small and soft man who declares having personally sent to the gas chambers over 2 million people. They presented this radical measure to stop the Jews destroying the German people. Now, it's always the same restraint from an emotional point of view, but what is Falco actually thinking himself? I mean, he's very displays a lot of pewter here when he hears us or Streischer or Frank Göring, all these anti-Semitic Nazis, and amongst the 8 judges there, does he know that one of them is a Jew, and that Jew, who's a magistrate, was excluded by the French Vichy government because he was Jewish? So he was evicted as not being able to be a judge in France and a magistrate in France, and then he becomes a judge there at Nuremberg. He was excluded the 17th of December 1940, like 48 other magistrates, by the Ministry of Justice of France at the time, just because he was a Jewish here. And the general Pétain himself, and I showed that, he actually extended those people that would be discarded, and he actually stated that during the Ministry of Council we can't have any Jews as magistrates here at the time. That's what Pétain said. A couple of months beforehand, Robert Falco was aware of it. He'd already been in the army during the First World War, and then he came back. He's listening to the radio. He's a refugee in Carcassonne, south of France, in June. And listening to the radio, he can see the violent anti-Semitic campaign, and that we can start hearing in France here. So he's excluded like all the other Jewish magistrates without any of his colleagues displaying any support whatsoever. But at the same time in Brussels, the first president of the higher court, and he publicly announced the exclusion of Jewish magistrates. Public statement towards the Germans here, and he was totally against the status of the Jews in Brussels. And he says that there's no problem whatsoever in having Jews present as magistrates here. Now, Robert Falco tried to stay as a magistrate. He tried to write a letter. Don't you think it's a bit excessive? Discrimination would strike the last balance, and if you consider the different regimen, don't forget that France is France. Robert Falco was always French before being a secular Jew here, but we'll see about that immediately afterwards. And there are lots of interesting letters. The State Council, so President Porsche, who's chairing this council, because now Robert Badinter afterwards, but at the time in the Second World War, it was said, no, the general, we don't consider that Falco had particularly served the state here. There's no reason to justify any exception for him, so he can't be a magistrate anyway. Coming back to what Laurent said, yeah, he hid in a small home which he built next to Toulon at Saint-Paul-de-Vent right until France was freed. And he read a lot at the time, and at the end he tried to move about here. He regretted the fact that some of the high magistrates wouldn't talk with him, and some other lawyers decided to shake his hand and not others, and he wrote this down. And it was very displayed a lot of pudor here. In 44 he received a telex here, and he went back here, and I won't go into that particular detail here. Now we're talking about the trains weren't working at the time, but anyway he went back here, back to a couple of episodes of his life here, and which explain how he ended up in Nuremberg. He born in 1882. His father was a diamond dealer. Very much, it's a French family who state themselves have been found. So secular, as I said earlier on, he had a big family. He became, he had a PhD in law. He loves culture, and he wrote a thesis, as we saw earlier on, in terms of the rights and duties of people when they're at a theatre here. But he's secretary of the Stars. He became a lawyer then. I actually found, as a young lawyer, you'll like that, Mr. Keita, he defended in 90 somebody who had actually raped a child here, but he avoided a person to actually be decapitated at the time here. He was always against the death penalty. Now, why did he become a magistrate? He was a business lawyer, a corporate lawyer, and he said he was being a corporate lawyer. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to live anymore, and he decided to become a magistrate. He was kind of bored stiff. You could really... And in fact, he became a prosecutor at La Seine, at the courts there. He was noticed as the man who didn't speak at Nuremberg, who was one of the best speakers, very intelligent. He can smile, at the same time he's very dangerous here. Best said, he's extremely powerful in terms of using irony. He's quite an adversary for the defendants here. But this man, he never was for the death penalty, but the prosecutor asked him to assist to one of the last death penalties in front of the prison of the Santé. He will be the general prosecutor who will sign the document, and in front of the last death penalty that took place, because it's in 1939 it was no longer a public kind of death penalty. It was actually done within the prisons. In 1940 he came back to his normal life after this dramatic interval here. 1944, sorry, and then he realized that he was appointed here. Then he found out, and the first president was actually imprisoned because for 1 month he had actually been the Ministry of Interior for the Maréchal Pétain. For the first time in his life he was appointed as a judge at the High Court, who had been a prosecutor throughout his life. So that's what he actually stated in June 1945, whereas I was working at the Court de Cassation, which is a Supreme Court, and of Pleasant. I was asked to become a magistrate at an international tribunal here, and they asked somebody who could speak English. He hadn't spoken English for 30 years. He was the only candidate who spoke English, and he was the only candidate to put himself forward here. And at the end, he thought he would represent, really, you're going to go to London. He thought he was going to represent the public prosecutor's office, but at the time, the people didn't see the relevance at all. He's got no particular mandate. He doesn't know what he's doing in London. Professor Gros is with him, who's a specialist of international law. He's welcomed by the ambassador, and who couldn't really care less. Hasn't got any particular instructions. Whereas Robert Jackson and the American delegation, they've anticipated everything regarding the IMT, as you mentioned earlier on here. He's opposed to this notion of conspiracy here, this kind of notion of a collective conspiracy defense delegation was totally against it because it's not within France's culture here. He'll try and introduce a couple of notions of French criminal law, but he'll sign in the name of France the 8th of August the agreements of London, which created this IMT, the International Military Tribunal here. So he wouldn't be a prosecutor. He realized that he was actually an alternate here. And that's where we have the very delicate episode. He mentioned this in his journal here. You know, Don Dieu de Vabre, and that was a discussion we had there, is attacked in a journal called Le Populaire. It's the only newspaper that said that he knew Frank in international congresses. And Henri de Donvieux mentioned this in the plane because it was published the same moment in the plane. He said, Don de Vabre several times went to Nazi congresses and he had dinner with Frank here, a situation that actually bothers him here. But at the same time, in his book, Robert Falco just stated the scrupulous consciousness of his colleague throughout the trial. That's all he said about the scrupulous straightness of his colleague. And I'll rapidly finish now. There were a lot of things that happened during the trial, but all that, it means that in the non-public aspects, which we find out in his journal, since he came back first, he enters obviously the room always first here, which is very important, and he's the one who found a compromise following the principles of Don Dieu in terms of this conspiracy, and that's enabled to move forward and to be able to come up with a relatively positive outcome. Number two, to show the difference between the Anglo-Saxon common law approach and then the opinion of a dissident or not, and it's a compromise that was actually found. When in the end we actually explain that the two Russian judges don't actually agree with part the three people that were going to be released, Van Papen, Sties and Up, and that was to avoid a dissident opinion, because for the French, you're not allowed to have a dissident opinion here. Descending, the difference in terms of the status of the judges. The Americans, they got all the means and resources, where they go back by plane here, whereas the French, they go back by train. You will actually see that they are not Henri Don Dieu de Vabre, they're not at all recognized. They'll just receive some medals here, but there's no recognition whatsoever. However, this network of magistrates will be extremely important after Maurice Roland. There will be an association of existing magistrates, and nearly all the magistrates Blandet, Dubost and Debenet, and they will play an essential role. Michel Mathieu mentioned it this morning during the presentation, and during the law that goes back to 1984, crimes against humanity. Those magistrates played an essential role in the French discussions afterwards. Now, after Nuremberg, Robert Falco actually didn't say that much anymore. He stayed in contact with Birket, with whom he remained friends. Why? Because he was invited to Gering to different conferences. Both of them loved poetry here. And the evening after listening to atrocities, they would talk about poetry in French and English here. Now, a question, an issue which isn't regarding the Shoah. There was a very clear opinion at the beginning of the 50s when the issue was to actually come up with a memorial in terms of for the Jews. Robert Falco belonged to those who consider, quoting him, the Jews don't, in their books, they don't want a monument. Why not have a monument for those French who they defended actually the Jews? Because otherwise, if we have a monument for the Jews, we'll be like supporting what Hitler did, which was to put the Jewish people aside here. And this is my conclusion here. At the court, higher court, he got his activity back, and he was appointed probably because he loves the literature. He became the reporter of this decree decree to revise Charles Baudelaire's condemnation in 1875. What we never mentioned. He came up with an amazing report, absolutely beautiful. He had this general prosecutor who had a very liberal position as well here. But I was knew that particular prosecutor. Where did I find him? For those who remember Section Spéciale Castagrover's film, it's the general prosecutor who chose those particular files of the Jews, communist Jews, and who had been persecuted, to have them condemned to death by what's called a special section. And since then, he was a resistant as of the end of 1944. He wasn't actually bothered at all here, and he was never considered as being a collaborator here, and it's quite. And then in conclusion, he asked his colleagues to really do something about the mistake made towards Baudelaire. I mean, over time we can see the true face of things here, and really make sure that the flowers of Baudelaire are paid a tribute to here, and this is really nice.